Hi, and good morning, everyone. We're starting a new series today of talks, and hopefully, I'll be giving talks on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday mornings, which will be available on the website from 11 o'clock on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. So if you go to dec.ie and you click on Dougie's Dailies, that's where you'll find me. And I presume you probably already know that because you're here watching this. But anyway, also we've asked some other people in the church to do some talks as well. And so they should be up on the website on Tuesdays and Thursdays. So there'll be a lot there to keep you going and to look at during the week. You'll remember that before Easter, in some of the talks that I gave, I decided that it'd be a good idea to tell some jokes. And just to kind of lighten the mood a bit, because everything kind of seems a bit heavy at the moment, especially when you turn on the news. And so I asked people how they thought the jokes were going. And my family said that the jokes were a source of deep humiliation to them. And so I decided to keep on going. And so thanks very much to Joanne Garbutt, who sent in these three jokes today. And the first one is a technical joke. What do you call a bee that is from the United States? Correct. A USB. Hope you like that one. And the next one is a it's about eating. Joke. A gastro joke, if you like. How have you ever tried to eat a clock? It's very time consuming. Okay. And the last one is a kind of a literary joke, really. What do you call a bear with no ears? B. Now, if you didn't get that one, the best thing to do is write it out, and then you'll get it, because it is one of those literary jokes. Anyway, enough of that rubbish. In my morning devotions over the last while, I've been reading from the Book of Kings, and I've been reading about the prophet Elisha. And I so enjoyed reading about him that I decided to do a few talks in the morning about him. Also, I've been preparing talks for Sunday mornings on the Beatitudes, which are the words of Jesus that we read at the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount. And it's interesting to me how, first of all, the life of Elisha and the life of Jesus have some certain similarities as well as some big differences. And in the teachings of Jesus on the Beatitudes and some of the teachings and the life of Elisha somehow seem to collide together, and they provide some interesting material for us to look at. So over the next couple of weeks, I suppose one of the things we'll be doing, it'll be a bit like a leaving cert question. Do you remember those questions you used to get in geography? Compare and contrast. Like compare and contrast the lowlands of the Netherlands with the highlands of Scotland, or something like that, and where you had to look at similarities and differences and write about them. So hopefully you'll find it somewhat interesting, as I did, to think about those things over the next couple of weeks. Like us, before I get to that bit, Elisha, interesting character, is venerated in the Baha'i faith, and he's also mentioned in the Quran as well, twice. And within the Quran, it is said that he is a righteous prophet who is exalted above the rest of creation. That's pretty impressive stuff, isn't it? And so you can think that within Islam, they think very highly of Elisha. However, you can only find the story of Elisha in the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, and his story is in the Book of Kings, 1st and 2nd Kings. It spans the two books, and so we're going to look at that bit of those books over the next little while. Like us, Elisha lived in pretty turbulent times. There was a lot going on in Israel that wasn't good. There was a pretty nasty king. He had a very nasty wife, Jezebel. Her name spawned women of disrepute, I suppose, over centuries and centuries later, and still is within the lexicon of words that we use. And also there was famine in the land at different times. There was also war, constant war going on between various tribes and nations. And So things were pretty tough in the land at the time. And so similar maybe to us in a way, though we don't have necessarily a war that affects us so much in Ireland. There are things going on, of course, which are making us feel very, I suppose, discombobulated at the moment and a bit unsure of ourselves. And so maybe through the writings and what we find out about Elisha, we will find some things that will give us encouragement and that will also challenge us over the next couple of weeks. One of the things that we read about Elisha over the span of his life is that he was a prophet, so he was the voice of God to the people. And I suppose one of the things that also makes him so incredibly famous is that he was a worker of miracles, just like Jesus. And in both those ways, he's similar to Jesus, that he spoke the word of God and he showed who God is through miraculous signs and wonders. We start today with the first mention of him in the Bible, which is in 1 Kings chapter 19. And the background to this part of the scripture is that the person who really educates Elisha is Elijah, the prophet who came before him. And Elijah was a magnificent man of God and one of the prophets, the great prophets of the Old Testament, who's still very much venerated within Judaism. And Elijah had just experienced the most amazing event where there was this big ceremony put forward where all the prophets of Baal were there with the king and you know the story well. I'm sure they built 2 altars and the prophets of Baal cut themselves and roared and shouted and all the rest of it, and nothing happened. And Elijah calls down the power of God, and there's a massive explosion, there's fire, the altar blows up, and the people all at the time supposedly turn back to God. But we realize afterwards that it's a very short-lived turning to God. But the people, the prophets of Baal, are executed at Elijah's instruction. After the event, and Jezebel, the queen, goes completely berserk, and she says that Elijah is going to be killed by her, that he won't see the morning. And Elijah, even though he has seen this incredible event happen, takes to his heels, runs into the mountains, and he's absolutely terrified. And we read that he hides there, and he's just absolutely in bits, and he's fed by an angel. And God feeds him through an angel, and then he goes into the rock, and God comes and meets with him in an incredible and special way. And so it's at the end of that chapter and that series of events that we are introduced to Elisha, who will be the person who will follow on after Elijah as being the voice of God to the people. So let's read from 1 Kings chapter 19 and verse 19. So Elijah went and found Elisha, son of Shaphat, ploughing a field. There were 12 teams of oxen in the field, and Elisha was ploughing with the 12th team. Elijah went over to him and threw his cloak across his shoulders and then walked away. Elisha left the oxen standing there, ran after Elijah and said to him, "First, let me go and kiss my father and mother goodbye, and then I will go with you." Elijah replied, "Go on back, but think about what I have done to you." So Elisha returned to the oxen and slaughtered them. He used the wood from the plough to build a fire to roast their flesh. He passed around the meat to the townspeople, and they all ate. Then he went with Elijah as his assistant. Elisha's name, by the way, means God is my salvation, or God saves. And we'll find out over the next couple of weeks that his name, as you probably know in Hebrew scriptures, that the name of a person is often of great significance. And in this case, that's true as well, where Elisha's name, God is God who saves, or God is my salvation, means a great deal, because this is the word that he brings to God's people over time. And he obviously was one of the people that was left in Israel who continued to serve God. There wasn't too many from what Elijah was complaining to God about. And so Elisha was one of the people who continued to serve God, even though so many of the others had run off and were serving the false god of Baal and Asherah. And the writer of the story tells us that the number of oxen in the field were 12. And you'd say, well, why would he give us that detail? And the reason he gives us the detail is because he wants us to know that Elisha came from a prosperous family. They obviously had a few quid. And so Elisha has a big decision to make. And he's there ploughing away with the oxen in the land when Elijah comes and throws his cloak over him, this hairy cloak. Now, this was no Hugo Boss jacket that he's putting around him. No, it's a hairy old cloak that probably smelt a bit. But it was a very significant thing to do, to put his cloak around the shoulders of Elisha. And the significance is about succession, about passing on what God has given him to the next person. Within the Assyrian culture of the time, we know this from other writings of the time, that it wasn't an unusual custom. A king would often put his cloak around the person, there often a son, to signify that this was the person taking on the mantle of the king after his death. And so in this case, when Elijah comes and he puts his cloak around the shoulders of Elisha, Elisha knows that this is a deeply, deeply significant act. And that's why Elijah says to him, you've got to think about what I've just done. And so Elisha, he goes and he says, well, I have to go and, be with my mum and dad, but think about this, And so he does that. And we also then see the similarities between how Elisha is called by Elijah and how Jesus called his disciples later on. Come, follow me. Leave what you're doing behind you and come, follow me. And it's a very significant moment in Elisha's life, as it was significant in the moment in the lives of the disciples when Jesus came and called them. Because it was calling him to a very different life to the one that he was currently leading. Now, it seems to me that even though much of Israel had turned their back on God and had walked away, that when we read this story, that we see that Elijah didn't do a whole lot of persuading. Elisha was ready for the call. And that's interesting to me because, first of all, how did Elijah know that this was the right guy? And I assume that he was led there by God's Spirit, and just the same way as Samuel was led to anoint Saul as king, or David as the second king of Israel, and just that God's Spirit came and just said, look, when you see this guy, you'll know it's the one. And he just knew that Elisha was the right one. And but I also believe that God must have been preparing Elisha for this event, that he must have been preparing him in his heart and his mind so that when Elijah came, he knew that this was right for him. Doesn't mean he didn't have a big decision to make. Doesn't mean that it wasn't scary or that it wasn't, frightening. But still, he knew that that's what God had called him to do. The thing about Baal worship at the time was that it was very involved with materialism. And it was a pragmatic sort of religion. And it was for pragmatic reasons that Israel had in many ways forsaken the God of their fathers and chosen Baal. Talk about that more in a second. But it also means that for Elisha, there was a rejection of materialism to go and follow Elijah. We don't know what his place in the family necessarily, or we don't know what he stood to inherit, but he certainly was turning his back on the family business and having all that land and so on to follow Elijah. And at the time, that wasn't necessarily considered to be a very wise or good thing to do, because let me just talk about the pragmatic sense of religion and Baal. The people decided to follow Baal because he was the one who supposedly promised fertility. He was a fertility god and promised that the rains would come at the right time. He was supposed to be the god of the seasons and so on. And the big temptation for Israel to follow him was that, of course, the rains would come at the right time, that their land would be fruitful, that they would all make money from it, be wealthy, well off, and so on. And that's why they were so easily ensnared into worshipping this false god, because of the promises, the promise that was made to them for worshipping him. Whereas for Elisha, there's not a whole lot of outcomes promised when Elijah comes and calls him. And there's not, like, he wasn't promised a great final outcome, like you'll be wealthy from this, or even that you'll have great power or authority. In his book, Beauty Would Save the World, which I'm really enjoying reading at the moment, Brian Zand has written this book, and I'm reading it in connection with the Beatitudes. He says this: we have a carnal obsession with outcomes. It's the ugly spectre of pragmatism. We want to see a clear and obvious way that our actions are going to result in the desired outcome. If you think about that, you'll say, well, you know what, that's probably true. And Brian Zand in the book, he gives a number of examples about how that is, and he says it's true in the church as well, unfortunately. And then at the end of the paragraph, he says something that I believe is really important. He says, obsession with outcomes is, among other things, an abandonment of faith. Obsession with outcomes, among other things, is an abandonment of faith. And when you think about that, it causes me to consider how we lead in the church, about how we do things, what outcomes we're trying to get guarantees for, and how we sometimes abandon faith in favour of what we think we can achieve. And so Elisha, even though he has a bright future mapped out in front of him, decides to heed the call. And so he slaughters his oxen, he roasts it using the wooden plough as the fuel for the fire. It's an act of some finality. Now this morning I was feeling a bit hungry when I got up out of the bed, and instead of having porridge, which is what I normally have, I decided I'd like to have a bacon and egg sandwich. And don't tell anybody. But anyway, I got out some bacon and an egg, and made some toast and put the two in between, a bit of tomato ketchup. You know, it's just gorgeous, isn't it? Yeah. And so I had that for my breakfast. And I was just thinking as I was writing this, and about Elisha, that the story of the pig and the chicken, which of course everybody knows, and in a bacon and egg sandwich, the chicken is involved because he provides the egg, but the pig is committed because he provides the bacon. And in this story, we read Elisha was committed. Not that he had to give his own life exactly, though he did have to give up, of course, part of his life, but that he destroys the very means of existence he has, which are the oxen and the plough. We don't know, maybe his family could have bought him a new one, but it's deeply significant what he does. He slaughters the oxen, he has a big party and invites the townsfolk along to eat the oxen. And he uses the plough for fuel, for the fire, for roasting the oxen. And I think that is a really significant thing he did to show that actually he was really deeply committed to this call and to this new life that God had called him to. So Elijah hasn't promised him wealth or power. He hasn't promised him an outcome. He just seems to say, you're the one, will you come? And so just to end this session this morning, I want to ask you a question. Is God preparing you for something at the moment? Has God been putting some ideas in your head about what he might be looking for you to do in the future? And then the question comes to us all. When it comes to the time, will you say yes? Now, there's a great temptation to think that this only applies to young people. That, when you're a bit older, that God won't call you to anything new. Let me just remind you, Moses was 80 when he was called to lead the people of God. So let's just pray before we head off for the day. Lord, thank you for your word and these ancient stories which speak to us even today, thousands of years later. Help us to be ready for your call and to be willing to say yes. Amen. So we'll see you with part 2 of this on Wednesday. God bless.